Chapter 28, The Black Widow, April 22nd, 2001. Stalker and Suave drove for hours, rolling north on the 101 past San Jose and San Francisco, crossing the Golden Gate, and finally winding past the dairy farms and wineries of Sonoma County. The disaster wrapped them like a heavy fog. There were so many questions about what had happened the day before and who the hell was in charge today. Stalker had mixed feelings about the meeting. Before he paroled the last time, he had lobbied to play a role on the periphery of the gang, but more and more, he was being pushed into the center of the action. It made him feel exposed in the open and not being in control of this, and it didn't sit well with him. Suave had reason to feel anxious too. He'd never been to a high-level meeting like this. Sullen and anxious, they sped past the farm country, where visitors roamed the back roads, drunk with wine and delight, blooming at yellow mustard flowers and hillsides of pale green, budding grape leaves. But Stalker and Suave were not turning off towards some charming Napa Valley Inn where tourists sip Chardonnay. The motel south of Santa Rosa would be your basic in-and-out joint where you could conduct business and no one would stick their nose in the door. Stalker and Suave had been summoned by the big homie for an emergency junta. But this was far worse than an emergency. It was an absolute catastrophe. The Salinas' crew's problems with Raymond Sanchez were piss water compared to what had just gone down. Never in the history of the cause had indictments and arrests been so far-reaching. Never had the FBI's claws reached the top. The untouchables had been touched. The day before, newspapers all over the country reported Robert Mueller's newfound round of indictments, including 13 members and associates of the Nuestra Familia, 5 of them the very top leaders of the Mesa on Pelican Bay. Added to the previous Salinas indictments, the total was now 24 and growing. The strategy was shocking as well as maddening. The feds had just arrested a bunch of guys already doing life. What the hell was the FBI doing this for? Coincidentally, Robert Mueller, that same prosecutor who rounded up Lobo and Rico in Salinas, had held his press conference here in Santa Rosa, where the papers said some local cop had been working up NF cases with the FBI. And now, the day after the news broke, the NF's top story man for all the streets was holding his own meeting in the same town. It was like two parallel governments, each trying to stay out of each other's sights. Besides bringing in the leaders, the feds had busted familianos in the Bay Area and the Central Valley, leaving entire regiments without leaders. For some reason, the Salinas crew was left more or less intact. The list of criminal charges was growing. The feds threw Maquillo's murder into the counts, making it all one gigantic mother of a racketeering case. The paper said prosecutors were considering numerous candidates for the federal death penalty, with Rico and Lobo's names high on the list. They said the gang had been under FBI surveillance for years. The filthy stain of informants was all over the case, and many of those indicted, once stalwart carnales, were already cooperating, according to the reporters. Between the indictments and the cooperators, the FBI had decimated the gang's highest echelons in such a swift, unexpected blow, it would have been admirable if it weren't so devastating. When the roadside motel sign poked above the trees, Suave and Stalker exited the freeway. They parked in a lot at the Los Robles Lodge, wondering if the meeting's urgency would allow them to broach their Chinatown problem. Painful as this day was, it was an honor to be summoned to the meeting that would determine the future of the entire familia. It had a future. The paper said the cops' big investigation was codenamed Operation Black Widow. As a creature that seduced and then killed its own loved ones, the image of a traitorous spider made a lot of sense these days. A half hour earlier, the big homie had scanned the motel room and tried out a seat in the most comfortable spot, a large stuffed armchair in the corner near a gigantic TV screen. The curtains were drawn, but the big homie left a section of window behind him uncovered so he could keep an eye on the outside world. You couldn't be too careful. 2 homeboys from Visalia had already arrived. That would have been Chino and Silver. And the Salinas boys, Stalker and Suave, were tied up in traffic but on their way. Considering the O had just been dealt a near fatal blow, the man in charge was surprisingly at ease. Nice and quiet, the big homie said, settling in. That's what I like. A large man with the build of a linebacker, the big homie's street title fit him. Yet he preferred to go by his Aztec name, Achali. One of his men, the main contender to head the Visalia regiment, now that its leader had been indicted, agreed the motel was nice, and again, that's Silver. Achali examined the furnishings, approving. It was just one of those old school motels from the 1960s or whatever, plain and clean and just classy enough for the junta Achali had in mind. I don't like those Motel 6s and shit, he said. The men laughed and tried to relax. Less than 48 hours had passed since the indictments went down. And for 2 days running now, the Santa Rosa paper was crammed with mugshots and big-ass headlines. Federal indictments cracked vast prison crime ring, and 13 named, death penalty sought against 2. The O was in shambles. Achali would have to raise familia security to its highest level in history. He wanted to explain in advance to his guests the precautions he'd have to take just for this meeting. There had been too many instances of snitches wearing body wires. You guys know, when these guys get here, we're all gonna, he began apologetically. Right, a homeboy cut in, cognizant of the dire nature of the times, to make sure we ain't got nothing. I'm not saying you guys, you know what I'm saying? Obviously, he's talking about checking them for wires. Achali said. It pained him to infer such a lack of trust. They understood. Strip search. Yeah, this fucking shit is fucked up, Achali continued, holding the newspaper. The whole time, he was sitting in that hotel room with the camera. The feds were in the next room over, watching from a camera they had inside of a clock radio on one of the dressers. Trip this, homie. He read aloud from the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. A new gang calling itself Nuestra Familia quickly emerged as a protector for the rural Northern California inmates against the firmly established, He did not enunciate the words Mexican Mafia. He threw the paper down. They're gonna milk this fucking shit that's coming out. The media is gonna milk it. For whatever they can, the second homeboy from Visalia agreed. Achali told his colleagues the feds were after him personally, but he was philosophical about it. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. I'll just keep on doing what I gotta do till I get caught, he said. The paper said one of those indicted was a rapper, and that memory made Achali fume. The rapper and the guys who make the GUN album were out there making movies and shit using the NF's brand. Achali said no, one in the O had seen one dime, but the brother from Modesto who produced the CDs had 5 cars, a brand new house, a boat, and all kinds of shit. The phone rang. Achali gave the caller directions to the lodge and turned back to his guests. The Salinas men were almost there. He explained to his boys that Stalker was the man in charge of security in Salinas. He's a good brother, Achali said. He's real close. He's one of the ones that's real close to the streets itself, where Sophie Rocha is concerned and Lisa Rocha is concerned. We need to keep an eye on them. Achali, too, had problems reining in the famous Rocha sisters. Out of respect for their brother Matt, you had to give them a pass, but boy, they were a handful. This is propaganda. They're both good homegirls. They're Mateo sisters, and this is just all a bunch of propaganda that this book is putting out, man. So, you guys don't believe this shit. Never had women known so much about the O, and it led to nothing but headaches. Oddly, Matt was not amongst those indicted, and was one of the few leaders left in Pelican Bay. While they waited, the men conjectured how long it would take for Cuete, Tibbs, and the other indicted leaders to be hauled down from the bay to the federal holding cells inside Alameda County Jail. Achali thought they might be transported this week. One of the homeboys asked what would happen if Achali was indicted. The man was the only ranking leader they could turn to now that the brass was swept up. If I go, they'd have to put someone in charge out here. All the crews would just have to function independently until somebody gets out, Achali answered. It would be chaotic, but there were professionals, and he believed they could handle it. So if I get tooken, if they take me, I'm separating myself from the street completely. His men didn't like it, but agreed. That was how it had to be. That's to take the heat off you guys, Achali said. You'll be notified ASAP because of my old lady. I gave her your number. He was now looking at homeboy from Visalia named Silver. The man was an up-and-comer. I told her that if anything ever happens to notify this cat. You can tell everybody else. I don't see it, but like I said, that's the first wave. You know what happens. Silver was disgusted at the many who fell so easily, turning snitch before the cuffs were on. People need to suck it up, he said with a sneer. The phone rang, and again, Achali gave final directions to the motel. Who are you with? He asked the caller. Did you guys bring any people up here? So I can tell these people not to shoot you guys. He let one out of his blooming laughs and hung up. Silver picked up a newspaper. When is this from? That's today. The media is going to be on a roll, man, Achali said. They're going to come up with all kinds of shit. They're going to make up a lot of shit. It was a shame. But all this attention meant they'd probably have to shut down their phony law firm. Only a month before, they'd successfully used their new Webster, Pierce & Associates letterhead to fire off a complaint to the streets about a dire lack of funds in the Familia's banks. In another legal brief disguised as an inmate class action lawsuit from the Bay, they had discussed who should run Salinas until Achali took charge. The red line worked beautifully, but now with the FBI all over their business, it was hard to tell what was safe anymore. The men glanced up. Someone's at the door. Suave and Stalker peered over their shoulders, scanning for anything amiss as they climbed the motel stairs and walked an open-air corridor on the second floor. Santa Rosa was unfamiliar turf, and you couldn't be too careful. A breeze blew and the trees rustled, but nothing seemed wrong. No cops or enemies in sight. They turned, knocked, and were welcomed into room 211. You want anything to drink or something? Achali asked, ushering them inside. A couple men settled atop the wide quilted bedspread. Stalker and Suave sat in chairs near the door, where two framed prints were attached to the wall. Achali told them the meeting would start once Chico arrived. Everyone knew Chico. He was an NF veteran and well-connected, a light-skinned black dude who'd always felt more at home with Mexicans. That's some bullshit. Chico's raza. Chico is not black. I don't know where the fuck they got that from. If anything, he's got some kind of Asian mixed with raza. Chico used to live in Salinas and for a time was Little Mondo's uncle through marriage to an aunt. Mondo grew up grateful to Uncle Chico for schooling him when he was a younger teen. Later, like so many others, Uncle Chico hooked up with Sophie Rocha. Eventually, he settled down with a new wife and was sent to work the Bay Area's drug markets. Achali hung up and turned to Suave. How was the drive? Kind of a long drive, but oh man, you guys is crazy, Achali scoffed. It can't be that long. He asked if they brought the heroin he had requested. Suave said yeah, it was in the car. They would deal with it after the junta. There was another knock, and Chico walked in accompanied by some rapper guy named Isaac. That's Gato from San Jose. Isaac Marquez. After embraces, handshakes, and introductions, Achali made the announcement. Before we start, we gotta strip. They understood. It was the New World Order. The men rose in unison. And the reason we got this going on, if you guys haven't seen the newspapers, you know, Achali said, as he too let his pants drop to his ankles. Not that we don't trust you. If you ain't got nothing to hide, you ain't got nothing to hide, he continued. They peeled off shirts, loosened belts, and dropped pants. Stripped to their boxer shorts, one of them asked if they were going to do the whole prison thing. Yeah, right. Grab your nuts, turn around, bend and cough. I don't think so. Each man laughed nervously until Achali said no. We ain't going to spread stuff. Relieved, they raised their arms. Let me see backs, Achali ordered, and they spun around like a troupe of linebacker ballerinas. Okay, we're cool. As they dressed, Achali eased into his armchair and launched into the meeting's primary topic, post-indictment security. They're going to shake trees, he said. They're going to try to throw fishing lines out there. They're going to try to get people to break. We have to find the weak links. Now, I'm not saying go as far as violence. I'm saying going as far as just push them away. We don't need any more violence right now. We don't need nothing happening right now, because if something starts happening, they're going to correlate it. Silver took over. This Sala Carnal clearly had leadership in his blood. If he could hold it down during this critical meeting, the Visa regiment would be his. First and foremost, it starts here, with each individual. What you let out, Silver said. That's the problem. That's a big problem we have today. Everybody wants to be, or they want the younger homies to know, yeah, I'm doing something. I'm about something. It's not about that. This organization is not about that. Business is handled that way, he said. Business is simply handled without bragging or loose mouths. Any upstart who knows too much and gets in their way has to be dealt with. Bottom line, if you guys know anybody who has anything on you, Silver said, nobody has to tell you what to do. If somebody takes your dope on the streets, you know what the hell to do. Stalker had already spoken on the phone with Acha Lee about the Raymond Sanchez question, so he didn't plan on speaking up here. He'd come away from the conversation unimpressed with Acha Lee, but now at the meeting, the man seemed in his element and in control. Stalker found the contrast fascinating. Besides the new federal indictments, 6 important people from the street regiments have been caught up in at least 2 months, Acha Lee said, 5 from Salinas alone. Bubba was among them. Although Acha Lee felt no love there, Bubba was on temporary freeze for talking too much to Sophie Rocha. Then the guy violated parole and got locked up again. He is inconsequential. It's a good thing that he left, or we would have had to hurt him, Acha Lee said. The thing is this. We have got to maintain a complete oversight of all our security. The mouth is killing us. The mouth is killing all of us. The mouth has always killed us. There were going to be big changes. They had to switch up their phones, use the Nextel ones that were harder to trace. They were to use fictitious names. Acha Lee held his own phone, explaining that it was listed under Natalie in New York. If they put a trace on this, you can't follow it back to me. You see what I'm saying? He said the feds now had listening devices that could pick up on shit thousands of miles away. This is technology, man. Acha Lee was on a roll, pontificating to an audience that didn't attempt to challenge him. He slouched in his corner chair looking like a relaxed pope. Supplicants circled around him. You guys are probably like, wow, the indictments just went out yesterday and we have a meeting here today. Well, that's why we have a meeting here today, because of the seriousness of this. We've got to start now, ASAP, today, to put more security on the streets. We got to, no question. From now on, every crime a crew committed had to be worth risking the heat it might bring. They needed a background everyone they dealt with. If you had to put a tail on them, you put a tail on them. They needed to switch up meeting places every time to keep the cops guessing. Guessing doesn't get us indicted. Getting caught acting, that's what gets us indicted, he explained. Silver steered them to a touchy item of business, the females. He made it clear the NF was no longer going to whack a motherfucker just because a female decided to mess around. This was a familiar tale to any man who'd been locked up. Guys could come sniffing around your ruka 10 minutes after you went in. That's our history. I'm sure you guys have heard that terminology, a black widow, Silver said. And homie's widow, he said, was sacred. If some guy comes fucking with her and she puts him at arm's length, then okay, dealing with the fool is obviously justified. But if she goes out and she's a willing participant, we're not into cleaning up people's domestic problems. Acha Lee agreed. If you're too worried about your old lady in the first place, you should have never went to prison in the first place. You should have been a good boy. If you have so much concerns about your old lady, then you're in the wrong business. You're running with the wrong crowd. Women are expendable. Bottom line, they're expendable. It had been a hell of a long drive, and Stalker and Suave discovered that Acha Lee had this habit of delivering long, painful monologues. They did their best to remain attentive as an hour passed. The big homie was at last getting around to the party they needed most to hear. The new street function protocol. It touched on their burning problem of Chinatown. Keep it professional was Acha Lee's message. We don't need people coming out here being gunslingers. I mean, we're not a bunch of gangbangers that rely on picking up a gun and making money. We have knowledge. We have ingenuity. We can do things without being violence involved. This was the mantra of the new O. There were, of course, exceptions. If a member was being disciplined and had to prove himself because he fucked up, making him go rob someone as punishment was permitted. The crew leaders were still allowed to hand him a cuete and say, all right, go handle business. That guy actually said was an expendable person. It was harsh, but it was business. Whether he's busted or not, we don't care. That's not our concern. All we care about is the money that he makes. That's the only time a person should be picking up a gun and going out robbing people, Acha Lee said. Stalker sat across the room from Achali, his eyes fixed on the leader. Stalker's legs were crossed, his right foot bobbing anxiously on his left knee, and he picked at his shoe and stretched his ankle. But his gaze did not veer as Achali touched on the question of threats to the familia's honor. If it crosses the line, then it's a different story, Achali continued. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're a man. You know what to do. Stalker nodded at the words, you're a man. And he kept nodding through the rest. Achali continued, I'll tell you like this though. Use your discretion. Is it going to be worth it? Ask yourself that. Stalker tried to silently translate these words into instructions the crew could work with. Violence was the NF's currency, the language used when communicating with rivals, but now it had to be deployed with discretion. He could appreciate the need to avoid drawing heat. The big homie was doing almost all the talking, and he had moved on to details of their drug business. Speaking for the first time since he arrived, Suave asked what they were supposed to do when dealers tried to cut in on NF drug turf. As far as there's other people out there selling in a certain area, you know what I mean? Suave said. Chinatown was a very important market, he said, probably the best they had. There was a lot of money flowing along the rundown alleys and train tracks. To Silver, there was no question as to the required response. Yes, they had to be cool about it. But if they were asking whether to go threaten the person and tell them to stop, then yes, he said, you have to do this. Okay, Suave said, reassured. I just wanted verification on that. Achali, however, cautioned Suave to weigh the value. Would it be worth the $50 to $100? Would that be worth us going to war with these cats? No, No, it won't, Suave agreed. Fuck no. Now, if it was $50,000 or a couple $1,000s, now that's a different story. The worth is always what makes the action, Achali said. If it's not worth it, then you shouldn't be in the action. If it's worth it, okay, let's sit down and make a plan. That seemed to settle it. The worth is always what makes the action. Chinatown, the Salinas' crew prime moneymaker, grossing a few thousand a day, was absolutely worth the action. The rapper, bro, Isaac, who came with Mondo's uncle Chico, hadn't spoken all afternoon, but suddenly he had something to say. They should all be jumping on ice as a new opportunity, he said. The man was a poet, but he had a head for business. Crystal meth was going to be huge. This new drug, made from Sudafed, was milder than that nasty old biker speed, and it could be smoked or snorted like coke. It was cheap, easy to make, and females adored it because they lost weight like crazy on it. The rapper declared that ice was the future. Achali was curious and let him explain. Our market's changing, the rapper said. We're gonna have to get into the ice business, dude. It might take 5 years, but they should get it now. Or we're gonna be at the tail end of it, where we don't make the money. We'll make some, but if we come first with the big quantity, we could get into that market. And the market is really taking off. It's the new crack. Uncle Chico agreed. A lot of hyenas love that shit, Achali acknowledged. But he didn't want to make a decision yet. It had been a long, wearing couple of days. Okay, he said, ready at last to call it quits. Anything else to bring up? This is open, brothers. You want to say something? Now's the time. Because once we leave here, I'm expect you guys to put your security at a high level. And there ain't no room for, oh man, I didn't know that. I was never told that. It's being said right here, being told to elevate your security to a higher level that it hasn't been. He was gravely serious now. We're all answerable to somebody. I answer to somebody. We all answer to somebody. You guys got to answer to somebody. And basically, we all answer to the organization. Chico had a final question about this new no violence policy. There was this brother who was threatening one of Chico's connections. You told me not to use violence, but dude won't stop, he said. Achali considered this. Then put the responsibility on Chico, saying, what do you think? That's a decision that you're going to have to make. Is it going to be worth it? He paused, as if deciding how to phrase the rest. And if it's going to be worth it, he said, how far do you need to take it to get your point across? On that, Achali was ready to adjourn. If there's anything else you guys want to put on the table, man, this is it. If not, then we'll just call it right now. No one spoke. Yet, it couldn't end here. After the devastating turns of the week, Achali needed to leave his men on a note of inspiration, infuse them with confidence to command their troops in case the captains went down for good. The entire familia was at stake. He looked sternly at each of them. They've already started their game plan, he said. Now we gotta start ours. We're gonna maintain this. We're gonna maintain it forever if we can. But it all starts with each of us here in this room today. That's where it starts. Everything else is up to you. It was a heavy responsibility, but the legacy of the O rested here at this moment in the Los Robles Lodge next to Highway 101. Achali's role was to direct and nurture, but ultimately he had to stand back and let these rising leaders do their jobs. You guys are gonna run your crews, how you gonna run them? You're gonna run your areas, how you gonna run them, he said. That's not my business. He rose to join Stalker and they walked into the motel's outdoor corridor. Suave still had to hand off the heroin he brought. Achali and the Salinas men descended the stairs to conduct their business in the parking lot, while the Carnales in the second floor room debated the cell block situation for their general and captains, whether they be separated or end up in a jail pod together. For the first time in its 35-year history, the NF was a rudderless ship, drifting with no destination. It was a bitter and sad state of affairs. Stalker and Suave said goodbye, and Achali climbed the steps, heavy with worry. This was exhausting work, trying to nourish hope in the O's darkest hour. The audacity of the Fed's actions was only now sinking in. The O's impunity, the Mesa sense of being forever untouchable, had been broken by these indictments. And these fucking informants, there was no other way to see it. The sanctity of the Familia had been violated. Achali rejoined the others in the room. It's something to laugh at, he muttered, but we're our own worst enemy. Silver and the other guy from Visa said goodbye, and only Achali, Chico, and the rapper were left. Achali paused to tell his closest confidants about one homeboy who was turning into a real hard case these days. He just ran over a squirrel and he was ecstatic about it. I just ran over a squirrel. I just hit a fucking squirrel. He's all happy about it. I got me a squirrel. They shook their heads in disgust. You ready, Cheeks? Achali said. Yeah. Let's bolt, Chico said. Drive safe, Holmes, Achali called out, watching as each man headed to his regiment and whatever destiny the Feds were sure to throw him. The Salinas men were on their way to the Golden Gate, and from there would drive south to the Monterey Bay. Maybe Achali was done for the day, but Stalker and Suave's discussion would continue into the night. Even if they didn't agree with it, Suave would have to lay down the new protocol. Don't go around looking for people to shoot. To Boxer and Mondo right away, especially to Mondo, who was on the front lines. Of course, if Raymond Sanchez kept cutting in on their business, well then, they'd have to revisit that plan.